A Daughter's Apologue, Mending Bonds in Family Conflict and Solution. Family Conflict and Solutions, welcome to Silent Wars. In today's video, we'll explore a deeply emotional journey through family conflict and solutions, shedding light on the struggles that many families face. If you're feeling lost or overwhelmed by family tension, this story might offer you some guidance and hope. Don't forget to give us a thumbs up if you find the video helpful, and make sure to subscribe to Silent Wars for more insightful content on resolving family conflicts. Sarah had always believed in the power of family. For her, family wasn't just a bond, it was the foundation of her life. At 60 years old, she had dedicated herself to raising her daughter, Lily, and supporting her husband, Mark, through thick and thin. Every meal she cooked was made with care, every holiday meticulously planned to ensure that they felt loved and connected. Sarah saved every dollar she could, investing in their future, thinking that one day they would all be able to enjoy the fruits of their hard work together. In her mind, family was sacred. It was her world, and she gave all of herself to it. However, life has a way of changing in an instant, and the fragile equilibrium that Sarah had built for herself and her loved ones began to crumble in the most unexpected and heart-wrenching way. Mark, the love of her life, passed away after a brief battle with cancer. The grief was unbearable. Mark had been her anchor, her companion for decades, and without him, the world seemed hollow. In the days following his death, the house felt unbearably empty. The laughter, the warmth, the everyday moments they had shared, all of it was gone in the blink of an eye. Sarah couldn't imagine going back to the house they had built together, filled with the echoes of their memories. As time passed, Sarah's sadness turned into an overwhelming sense of loneliness. She was adrift in a sea of grief, but she kept reminding herself that she still had Lily. After all, Lily was her only child, and they had always been close. Mark had been everything to her, but Lily was her legacy, her continuation in the world. She believed that, no matter how difficult things were, they would be okay as long as they had each other. But when Sarah went to Lily for help, she had no idea how drastically her world would shift. Lily, who had always promised that she would be there for her mother, extended a hand, offering Sarah a place to stay. It should have been a comforting gesture, a sign of love and family support. However, the moment Sarah stepped into Lily's home, she felt the first cracks in the facade that she had worked so hard to build. It wasn't just the empty house that had once been theirs. It was something deeper, something unspoken in the way Lily's husband, Jake, acted around her. Jake, a man Sarah had welcomed into their family with open arms, barely acknowledged her presence. When Sarah tried to engage him in conversation, asking about his day or how things were going, he gave her short, dismissive responses. It wasn't that Jake was outwardly rude, he was passive-aggressive. He would roll his eyes when she asked a simple question, as if she were an inconvenience. If she tried to watch her favorite show on TV, he would change the channel without a word, leaving Sarah feeling invisible. It started with small things that she could overlook in the beginning. After all, she was just staying there temporarily. Maybe he was busy or stressed. But as the days went on, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. At first, she tried to justify Jake's behavior. He was probably just going through a tough time, she thought. Maybe he was adjusting to having Sarah stay with them, or maybe it was something to do with the stress of his job. But then, the comments started, snide remarks that cut deeper than Sarah could have imagined. She overheard Jake muttering under his breath one day as he passed her in the hallway, calling her a freeloader. Sarah froze in her tracks, the words echoing in her mind. She tried to convince herself that she had misheard him, but deep down, she knew she hadn't. What hurt more than the words, though, was Lily's silence. Sarah looked to her daughter for support, for some kind of defense. Surely Lily would stand up for her mother, wouldn't she? But no. Instead, Lily would brush it off, always coming to Jake's defense. "He's just stressed," she would say. "Work's been rough." It was as if Sarah's pain, her frustration, was invisible to her own daughter. She had raised Lily to be strong, independent, and compassionate. But now it seemed that Lily was willing to turn a blind eye to the cruel treatment that was unfolding right under her nose. Sarah swallowed the shame that welled up inside of her. She didn't want to cause trouble, didn't want to make waves in her daughter's home. So, she stayed quiet. She stayed out of the way, cooking when she could, cleaning, and offering to run errands. She told herself that it was just temporary, that things would get better. But they didn't. One night, everything came to a head. Sarah had spent the afternoon making a homemade chicken pot pie, Jake's favorite meal, in the hopes of bringing some warmth to the evening. But when they sat down to dinner, the atmosphere was suffocating. Lily was scrolling on her phone, barely acknowledging Sarah or the food she had lovingly prepared. Jake sipped his beer, silent, his face a mask of irritation. The silence at the table was unbearable. Sarah tried to fill the void with conversation, but no one responded. Then, out of nowhere, Jake spoke. His voice was cold and calculating. "You know, maybe it's time we stop pretending this is temporary," he said, looking directly at Sarah. "We're not a charity." Sarah's heart dropped. She could feel the blood draining from her face as she tried to process his words. What did he mean by that? Was he suggesting that she should leave? That she had overstayed her welcome? The words hung in the air, suffocating Sarah as she looked at her daughter, searching for some kind of response. But Lily didn't meet her eyes. Instead, she muttered, "Maybe it's best if you find something more stable, for everyone's sake." It wasn't just a rejection. It was a dismissal of everything Sarah had done for them, for their family, for their lives together. It was a blow to the core of her being. In that moment, Sarah knew she had been discarded. She stood up, her hands shaking, and silently walked to her room. She packed her belongings, 2 suitcases, the remnants of a life she had built with love and dedication. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She simply left. As Sarah stood outside their building, the wind cutting through her coat, she realized that she had nowhere to go. No one had walked her out. No one had cared enough to say goodbye. She sat on the curb for an hour, feeling the weight of her abandonment settle in. Her phone battery was dead. Her heart was too. In that moment, Sarah understood what it felt like to be erased, to be forgotten by the people she had given everything for. The isolation, the loneliness, the abandonment, they all sank in with the cold of the night. For the first time, Sarah felt invisible. Her daughter, the person she had nurtured and cared for all her life, had chosen her husband's words over her mother's love. The world she had known was gone, and Sarah was left standing in the cold, with nothing but the echoes of a family that once loved her. Sarah had always been the heart of her family. For years, she had poured all her love and energy into building a life with her husband Mark and their only daughter, Lily. Every meal she cooked was seasoned with care, every holiday meticulously planned, and every day spent working hard for the future. She had believed, with every fiber of her being, that the love she gave to her family would be returned in kind. But nothing could have prepared her for the cruelty that was about to unfold in her own home. It had been a difficult year. Mark's death from cancer had left Sarah shattered, as if her very soul had been ripped from her body. Her grief was immeasurable. Mark had been her partner, her love, her life. Now, without him, Sarah was struggling to find her footing. She couldn't stay in the house they had built together, where every room echoed with the memory of him. So, with no other choice, she turned to Lily, her daughter, for help. Lily had always been her greatest joy. Raising her had been Sarah's proudest accomplishment. Even when Mark had been sick, Sarah found solace in the bond she shared with Lily. They were family, and family, Sarah believed, meant unconditional love and support. But after Mark passed, the foundation that had once felt so strong began to crack. When Lily and her husband Jake offered her a place to stay, Sarah was grateful but nervous. She didn't want to be a burden on them, especially not after all the years she had spent being the one who supported everyone else. But she told herself that this was temporary, that things would get better, and that they would all heal together as a family. However, from the moment Sarah moved into their home, she began to feel like an intruder. Jake, who had once seemed like a kind, caring man, now barely acknowledged her existence. He was always on his phone, often making sarcastic comments under his breath, his irritation palpable whenever Sarah tried to engage him in conversation. She told herself it was just the stress of adjusting to her living there. Maybe Jake was uncomfortable, and maybe things would get better with time. But as the days turned into weeks, Jake's behavior only worsened. The small slights escalated into open hostility. Sarah would offer to help with dinner, but Jake would roll his eyes and tell her to leave it to him. If she tried to watch her favorite show on TV, he would change the channel without a word, as if her presence was an inconvenience. The hurt began to pile up inside Sarah, and with each dismissive action from Jake, she felt her dignity slipping away. She looked to Lily for support, but her daughter, who had once been so close to her, remained silent. Lily would shrug off the tension, saying things like, "Jake's stressed, Mom." You know how it is. Sarah swallowed the sting of those words. She tried to convince herself that things would get better, that she was just overreacting. But deep down, she knew she wasn't. She knew something was wrong. This wasn't the family she had worked so hard to create. It wasn't the love and support she had always imagined would surround her in her golden years. And yet, she stayed. Because she believed in family. Because she believed in unconditional love. But everything changed one fateful night at the dinner table. It was a simple meal, a chicken pot pie Sarah had made from scratch, Jake's favorite. She had spent the afternoon cooking, trying to make the best of their strained situation. She thought that maybe a home-cooked meal would bring them all together, even if just for a moment. But as they sat down to eat, something shifted in the air. The tension that had been building for weeks reached its breaking point. Lily was scrolling through her phone, as usual, barely looking up, and Jake was sipping his beer, his face indifferent. The silence at the table was suffocating, the kind of silence that fills a room with so much weight, you can hardly breathe. Sarah tried to break the silence by offering a light-hearted comment, but it fell on deaf ears. And then, out of nowhere, Jake spoke. "Maybe it's time we stop pretending this is temporary," he said, his voice cold and calculated. "We're not a charity." Sarah's stomach dropped. It felt as if the words hit her like a punch to the gut. She froze. How could Jake say that? How could he speak to her like this, in her own daughter's home, after everything she had done for them? The room seemed to close in around her. Her heart raced as she turned to Lily, desperate for some kind of support. She needed her daughter to say something, to stand up for her, to say that Jake was wrong, that they were family, and that no one should be treated this way. But Lily didn't speak. She didn't defend her mother. She didn't even look at Sarah. Instead, she nodded, her eyes still glued to her phone, as if this was just another uncomfortable moment to be endured. "Maybe it's best if you find something more stable," Lily mumbled. "For everyone's sake." The words stung like 1,000 cuts. Sarah could hardly believe what she was hearing. Her daughter, the one person she had loved and cared for more than anything in the world, was now telling her that it was time for her to leave. No argument, no fight. Just the cold, unfeeling suggestion that she was no longer wanted, no longer needed. It wasn't just rejection, it was abandonment. And it came from the last person Sarah ever expected. In that moment, Sarah's heart shattered. She had given everything to her family, sacrificed her own needs for them, and yet here she was, thrown out like yesterday's trash. She didn't scream. She didn't argue. She couldn't. There was no fight left in her. With trembling hands, she stood up from the table and silently walked to her room. She packed 2 suitcases, 2 measly suitcases, and that was all she had left. No argument, no plea for understanding. Just the cold, painful realization that she had been cast aside. As she walked out the door, leaving behind the family she had built her life around, she didn't look back. Not even once. Outside, the wind bit through her coat, and the harsh reality of her situation hit her like a ton of bricks. She had nowhere to go, no one to turn to. Her daughter hadn't walked her out. Jake hadn't even bothered to pretend to care. Sarah sat on the curb for an hour, the tears threatening to spill over, but she held them back. She couldn't cry. Not now. Not when she had already lost everything. In that moment, Sarah understood what it felt like to be erased. She wasn't just kicked out of her daughter's home. She had been erased from her daughter's life, from her family, from everything she had worked so hard to build. All the love, all the sacrifices had meant nothing. They had all been forgotten the moment she was no longer convenient. The emptiness was unbearable. The loneliness was suffocating. And yet, Sarah didn't break. She didn't scream, didn't beg for her daughter's love. She simply walked away, knowing that sometimes the hardest thing you can do is to let go. The fluorescent lights buzzed above Sarah as she stepped into the dingy motel room, the harsh glow flickering intermittently, casting a sickly light over the small space. The stale air clung to her, thick and suffocating. The smell of old carpet, faint traces of cigarette smoke, and the faint, unplaceable scent of mildew settled into her lungs. She was alone, completely, utterly alone. Her heart felt like it was caving in on itself. Everything she had worked for, every sacrifice, every ounce of love she had poured into her family had come to this. A cold, empty room. 2 suitcases with the few possessions she had left, scattered carelessly on the bed. No one had asked if she was okay. No one had checked on her. The harsh reality of her new life settled in with a painful weight, a weight she didn't know how to lift. She dropped her bag onto the floor with a heavy sigh and collapsed onto the bed, her eyes fixed on the ceiling. The same ceiling she had stared at countless nights in her own home. But this time, it felt different. In the past, that ceiling had been a comfort, a symbol of the family she had worked so hard to create. But tonight, it was a reminder of the void that now consumed her. Her thoughts raced back to the night she left Lily's apartment. How easily it had happened. She had expected a fight, a confrontation, something. But instead, the words had come from Lily's mouth with such casual indifference, as if Sarah's presence in her life no longer mattered. "Maybe it's best if you find something more stable," Lily had said, her voice flat, unfeeling. Those words had felt like a slap to the face, like all the years she had spent nurturing, loving, and sacrificing for her daughter had meant nothing. Her chest tightened as she recalled the sound of the door closing behind her, the finality of it. That was the moment she knew, deep down, that she had lost everything. Her daughter had turned her back on her, and her son-in-law, Jake, had made it clear that she was nothing more than a burden. His words, casual yet cruel, still echoed in her mind. "We're not a charity." The thought of those words made her stomach churn with disgust. How had it come to this? How had the family she loved, the family she had built her life around, become so cold and distant? Sarah wiped a tear from her cheek, not even realizing it had fallen. The loneliness in the motel room was unbearable. She had never felt so small, so invisible. Every attempt to reach out to Lily had been met with silence. She had sent text after text, each message filled with love, each one begging for a response. But nothing came. Not a word, not a call. 3 months had passed, and still, Lily's phone calls remained unanswered. Sarah had no one. She was alone, lost in a sea of silence, the weight of it all pressed down on her chest. She had always been the strong one, the one who held everything together. She had been the one to raise Lily, to protect her, to make sure she had everything she needed. But now, she had nothing. No home, no family, no future. Just the empty walls of the motel room and the silence that surrounded her. She didn't know where to turn, didn't know what to do next. The despair was suffocating, and for the first time in her life, Sarah felt truly powerless. She tried to distract herself, turning on the television in the corner of the room, but it was no use. The noise of the screen only amplified the silence in her mind. She couldn't escape the thoughts, the feelings that were swirling inside her. What had she done wrong? How had things gone so wrong? She had given everything to her family, to Lily. She had sacrificed her own happiness, her own needs, to make sure they were cared for, to make sure they were happy. And yet, here she was, sitting in a dingy motel room, wondering how she had ended up here. The tears came, slowly at first, then in waves. Sarah's body trembled as she let the sorrow wash over her. She hadn't cried like this since Mark passed away. The grief from losing him had been overwhelming, but this was different. This was the loss of her daughter, the one person she had always believed would never turn her back on her. How could she have been so wrong? How could she have been so blind? 3 months. 3 months without a word from Lily. 3 months of silence that felt like a lifetime. Sarah had spent that time in limbo, trying to find a way to pick up the pieces of her life, but the pieces didn't fit anymore. The life she had known was gone. The family she had built was shattered. And no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't put it back together. In the solitude of the motel room, Sarah's mind wandered back to the times when she and Lily had been close. She remembered the little girl who had run to her with scraped knees, the teenager who had confided in her about her first heartbreak, the young woman who had promised to always be there for her. Where had that girl gone? What had happened to the bond they once shared? The sound of the shower running from the neighboring room broke Sarah from her thoughts. She glanced at the clock. It was late, well past midnight. She hadn't slept in days. The weight of the loneliness had become too much to bear, and now it felt like the silence in the room was swallowing her whole. She glanced at her phone again, hoping for a message, a sign that Lily might finally reach out. But there was nothing. The screen remained dark, just like her heart. She thought about leaving, about heading back to Austin, about trying to fix things with Lily. But then she thought about the words Jake had said, about how he had treated her, and she realized something. She couldn't go back. Not now. Not when the one person she had loved and cared for so deeply had cast her aside so easily. Sarah took a deep breath and stood up from the bed, her legs shaking as she walked to the window. She looked out at the darkened streets below, her heart heavy with the weight of everything that had happened. She didn't know what the future held or if she would ever see her daughter again. But in that moment, she knew one thing. She wasn't going to let herself be erased. She wasn't going to let the silence consume her. She would fight, even if it was just for herself. It was a quiet evening, one of those rare nights when the world seemed to stand still. Sarah sat on the edge of the small motel bed, surrounded by boxes of old keepsakes she had collected over the years. Most of the items were small, insignificant reminders of a life she once knew, photos of family holidays, old letters, a few dusty trinkets. But as she sifted through the contents, her fingers brushed against something that made her pause. An old, worn journal. The leather cover was cracked with age, the pages yellowed and fragile. Sarah didn't remember packing the diary, and yet, there it was, tucked at the bottom of the box, hidden away for reasons she couldn't fathom. She held it in her hands, unsure of what to expect. It had belonged to her mother, a woman who had passed away many years ago. Her mother had always been a woman of secrets, someone who kept her emotions close, rarely sharing much about her past. Sarah had long accepted that her mother's life was a closed book. But tonight, as she stared at the journal in her hands, something inside her stirred. Maybe it was the loneliness she had been grappling with, or maybe it was the weight of everything she had lost. Either way, Sarah felt an undeniable pull to open it. With a deep breath, she gently opened the first page, the smell of old paper filling the air. The handwriting was neat, familiar, the elegant script her mother had used for years. The early entries were mundane, typical of a diary. Mentions of the weather, day-to-day life, the kind of small details that Sarah had come to expect. But as she turned the pages, she began to notice something odd. Her mother's tone shifted. The words grew more emotional, more passionate. And then, in a quiet entry dated August 3rd, the truth hit Sarah like a punch to the gut. The entry began innocently enough, describing an ordinary day, but then it took a turn. Her mother wrote about a man named Robert Sterling, an affluent businessman in their town, someone Sarah had heard of but never truly known. Her mother's words were full of longing, regret, and an intensity Sarah had never seen in her mother before. She had always thought of her mother as reserved, composed. To see her so vulnerable, so full of unspoken desire, was a shock. As Sarah continued reading, the entries grew more detailed. It was clear now that her mother had been involved in a secret affair with Robert Sterling, one that had spanned several years. The affair was not just a brief fling, it was a deep, emotional connection, one that her mother had kept hidden from everyone, including Sarah. She had written about their clandestine meetings in dark, quiet corners of town, away from prying eyes. The diary described stolen moments, whispers of love, shared glances, and the kind of passion Sarah had never known existed in her mother's life. Sarah's heart raced as she turned the pages. She couldn't believe what she was reading. Her mother had been in love with a man who was not her father. The idea of it sent waves of confusion and disbelief through her. Her mother, the woman who had always been so strong and stable, had carried this secret for years. And now, here Sarah was, alone in a motel room, unraveling the hidden past of the woman who had raised her. But the most shocking part of the diary came on the following page, where her mother had written about a promise that would change everything for Sarah. Robert Sterling, it seemed, had made arrangements for her mother in case anything ever happened to him. He had promised that if he died, he would ensure that Sarah's mother would be provided for, that she would have a piece of what he had built. There were mentions of a trust, a letter, and a lawyer named Leonard Goldstein. Sarah's breath caught as she read the words again. She had heard her mother mention Mr. Goldstein before, but she had never known the full extent of the connection. It was clear now that her mother's life was not as simple as Sarah had always believed. The promise was written in a way that made Sarah's heart pound in her chest. Her mother's words spoke of a legacy, a hidden fortune that Sarah had never known about. She had always thought of herself as just a grieving widow, someone left behind with nothing but memories. But now, she realized that she was tied to something much bigger, a secret past that held the key to her future. Sarah closed the diary for a moment, her hands trembling. The realization hit her like a flood. She wasn't just the woman who had lost her husband. She wasn't just the mother who had been abandoned by her daughter. No, she was something more. She was the daughter of a woman with a secret history, a woman who had been connected to powerful people in ways Sarah had never imagined. The diary had unlocked something in Sarah, something she hadn't felt in a long time: hope. For the first time in months, she felt like she had control over something in her life. She wasn't just lost in the pain of her past, she was holding the key to something bigger, something that could change everything. The future, once filled with uncertainty and despair, now seemed to hold endless possibilities. With newfound determination, Sarah set the diary down and pulled out her phone. She quickly searched for Leonard Goldstein, the lawyer her mother had mentioned in the diary. It didn't take long for her to find his contact information. A call was made, and within hours, she had an appointment scheduled. Sarah knew she had to follow this lead. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew one thing for certain: the secret her mother had kept hidden was no longer buried in the past. It was Sarah's now, and she was going to use it to take back her life. As Sarah sat back in the chair, her mind racing with the possibilities, she couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. For the first time since Mark had passed, for the first time since Lily had turned her back on her, Sarah felt like she was on the verge of something. The road ahead was uncertain, but the truth was finally in her hands. And with that truth came a power she had never known before. It was time for Sarah to reclaim her life, and this time, she wasn't going to let anyone take it from her. The phone call came unexpectedly. Sarah had been sitting in the small motel room, sipping on a cup of lukewarm coffee and staring at the empty space in front of her, when the number appeared on her screen. It was from Leonard Goldstein, the lawyer her mother had mentioned in the diary. The moment she saw his name, her pulse quickened. Could this really be the moment her life began to change? She wasn't sure, but she answered the call anyway. "Hello, Ms. Daniels." Leonard's voice came through the receiver, smooth and calm, but with an undercurrent of something that Sarah couldn't quite place. "I've received your letter, and I believe it's time we meet. There's something important I need to share with you. Something that I think will make everything clearer." For a moment, Sarah just stared at the phone, her breath catching in her chest. She had been holding her breath for months, waiting for some kind of answer, some direction, some reason to hope. And now, it seemed, that answer was finally coming. "Can we meet tomorrow?" Leonard continued. "I have the documents here. I believe it's best we discuss this in person." Sarah's mind raced. She hadn't expected this moment to come so suddenly. Her world had been darkened by so much loss and rejection. Was this the breakthrough she had been waiting for? Was this the moment that would give her the power she so desperately needed? The meeting was arranged for the next day. When Sarah arrived at Leonard Goldstein's office, the lawyer greeted her with a professional but kind smile. He led her into a small conference room, a space filled with the faint smell of old books and polished wood. As he sat down across from her, Sarah couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. She didn't know what was coming, but she could sense the importance of it. Leonard placed a thick envelope on the table in front of her. It was sealed tightly, as though whatever lay inside was too important to be revealed hastily. Her heart thudded in her chest as she stared at the envelope. What could this be? Was this the inheritance her mother had left behind? "Sarah," Leonard began, his voice steady, but there was an edge of something in it now, perhaps excitement or even reverence. "You may not know this, but you're not just your mother's daughter. You're also the daughter of Robert Sterling, the founder of Sterling Energy, one of the most well-known business empires in Central Texas." Sarah's world tilted. She froze for a moment, trying to process his words. Her mind scrambled, her thoughts a tangled mess. She wasn't just an ordinary widow. She wasn't just Sarah Daniels, the woman who had been abandoned by her daughter. She was the daughter of Robert Sterling? The Robert Sterling, the powerful businessman who had shaped the town they lived in? "What do you mean?" Sarah finally whispered, her voice hoarse. "I don't understand." Leonard's gaze softened as he pushed the envelope closer toward her. "Your mother kept this secret for a long time, Robert Sterling was a part of your life, and you didn't even know it. But before he passed away, he made sure that you would have a portion of his estate, hidden away from his family. Sarah's hands shook as she reached for the envelope, her fingers trembling as she tore it open. Inside, there were several documents, bank accounts, property deeds, investment portfolios, all detailing a fortune she never knew existed. Her eyes widened as she read the figures. Over $1 million. She hadn't imagined it could be this much. The room seemed to close in on her as she stared at the documents. She wasn't just an old woman discarded by her daughter. She wasn't just someone left alone with nothing but memories of a life that had passed her by. No, this was something entirely different. She was someone with power. She had a future now, one that she could shape for herself, on her own terms. For the first time in what felt like forever, Sarah felt seen. Leonard continued speaking, but Sarah was barely listening. She was too caught up in the shock of it all. Her life had been a series of losses, one after another, and now, out of nowhere, she had been handed something extraordinary. A legacy, a future, a chance to rebuild. She wasn't invisible anymore. She wasn't the woman who had been tossed aside and forgotten. Her heart raced as the weight of the moment sank in. This wasn't just about money, it was about control, about the ability to make decisions that would shape the rest of her life. The money was significant, yes, but it was the freedom that came with it that meant the most to her. She could finally take care of herself. She could finally make a life that wasn't dictated by the cruelty of others. For years, Sarah had lived in the shadow of her family, the shadow of her husband's illness, the shadow of her daughter's neglect. But now, she was no longer just a shadow. She was the one in control. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living. I know this may be a lot to take in, Leonard said softly, as though sensing the whirlwind of emotions inside her. But this is yours now. All of it. Robert Sterling made sure of that. And you're the rightful heir to his wealth, his legacy. Sarah blinked back tears. She had never imagined that life would give her something like this. She had thought she was beyond hope, beyond repair. But in this moment, everything changed. She was no longer the woman who had been cast aside. She was no longer the woman who had been erased from her daughter's life. She was Sarah Daniels, a woman with a past that had been hidden, but now laid bare, a woman with a future she could shape however she wished. As Sarah left Leonard Goldstein's office that day, the weight of the envelope felt different in her hands. It wasn't just a stack of papers, it was her ticket to freedom. It was the beginning of a new chapter in her life, a chapter where she was in charge, a chapter where she would no longer let anyone take away her dignity. She had found the strength to survive. Now, she had the strength to thrive. For the first time in months, Sarah didn't feel afraid. She didn't feel like she was drowning in the endless sorrow of her past. She felt empowered. She felt alive. And with that feeling, she knew one thing for sure. The road ahead would be hers to travel. And no one could take that away from her. Sarah's life had been a series of quiet sacrifices. For years, she had lived for everyone else, and in the process, she had lost herself. When she found the diary, the secret inheritance, and the truth about her mother's past, it felt like the universe had handed her a lifeline. No longer the forgotten wife or the discarded mother, she was now a woman who had the means, the strength, and the freedom to shape her own future. With the wealth from her unexpected inheritance, Sarah took the first steps toward reclaiming her life. She rented a small apartment in the city, far from the quiet, sleepy town where she had spent most of her years. It was a modest space, nothing extravagant, but for the first time in her life, it was hers. It was a place where she could finally breathe, where she could start fresh. No more reminders of the life she had lost. No more shadows of rejection hanging over her head. The apartment was small, with just enough room for her belongings, a couple of comfortable chairs, and a cozy bed. The walls were bare, except for a few pictures she had brought from the motel, and the faint scent of new paint filled the air. It wasn't much, but it was enough for her. She didn't need more. This space gave her the peace she had been searching for, a quiet place where she could hear her own thoughts, uninterrupted by the noise of the world around her. A place where she could start healing. Sarah began to change. She had always dressed in simple, practical clothing, but now she found herself gravitating toward clothes that made her feel confident, clothes that reminded her of her worth. She started wearing blouses in shades of blue and green, colors that brought out the sparkle in her eyes. Her wardrobe wasn't flashy or expensive, but it was hers. Every item of clothing felt like a small act of rebellion against the years of self-sacrifice and invisibility she had endured. In the mornings, Sarah would wake early and take long walks around the neighborhood. She walked for hours, letting the crisp air fill her lungs and clear her mind. She had forgotten what it felt like to simply walk for the sake of walking, to let her mind wander without any destination in mind. It was during these walks that she began to feel a sense of freedom she hadn't known in years. She wasn't walking for anyone else's approval, or to meet anyone else's expectations. She was walking for herself. But no matter how much she changed, there was still a part of her that felt empty. A part of her that still longed for her daughter, Lily, the daughter she had given everything to, the daughter who had, in many ways, cast her aside. It was a wound Sarah couldn't fully heal. Despite all the changes in her life, despite the newfound strength she had discovered in herself, she couldn't fill the void that had been left behind by the silence of Lily's absence. The ache in her chest grew as the days passed. Sarah had always been a mother, always been the one who gave. But now, for the first time in her life, she was learning to live for herself. It was a bittersweet realization. She was living, but she wasn't living fully. She wasn't whole. Not yet. Determined to secure her future and never feel powerless again, Sarah threw herself into learning. She started attending business seminars, attending workshops on investing, and reading books about building wealth. She wanted to learn everything she could about managing her newfound wealth, about making smart decisions for her future. She wanted to make sure that she would never be in a position where she felt dependent on anyone else again. At first, the seminars were overwhelming. The language of business, investing, and finance felt foreign to her. But she was determined. She took notes, asked questions, and slowly began to piece together a plan. She learned how to invest in real estate, how to build a diversified portfolio, and how to protect her wealth for the long term. Every piece of knowledge she gained felt like a victory, a small step toward independence, a small step toward her own future. But despite all the changes, there were still moments when the loneliness crept in. Sarah would sit on her couch, surrounded by the books she had been reading, the notes she had taken, and the plans she had made. But the absence of her daughter, the absence of the family she once had, hung heavily in the air. She thought about the times she had spent with Lily, the meals they had shared, the laughter they had enjoyed. She thought about how her daughter had once been her whole world. The loneliness wasn't something that could be fixed with wealth or success. It wasn't something that could be filled with new knowledge or new opportunities. It was a wound that ran deep, a wound that no amount of money could heal. Sarah had given so much of herself to others, and now, as she tried to rebuild, she realized that there were parts of her that had never been acknowledged, parts of her that she had forgotten in the name of duty and love. Even as she learned to thrive in the city, even as she learned to embrace her independence and newfound power, Sarah couldn't help but long for something she couldn't have. She missed the closeness she once had with Lily, the easy conversations, the shared moments. She missed the family she had lost, and no matter how much she changed, no matter how much she achieved, the hole left by her daughter's absence could never be filled. But Sarah was strong. She knew that. She had survived the hardest years of her life, and now, she was learning to thrive. She wasn't done yet. The road ahead might be difficult, but it was hers to walk. And for the first time in a long time, she wasn't afraid of the future. She was ready. Ready to live for herself. Ready to take control, and ready to rebuild her life on her own terms. She had come so far, and now, with every step she took, she was reclaiming the pieces of herself she had lost along the way. Sarah may have started this journey feeling lost and broken, but with each new day she grew stronger. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was living, and she was determined to make the most of the life she had left. Because at the end of the day, Sarah knew one thing for sure: no one could take away her power, her strength, or her ability to choose her own path. She was finally free. Sarah hadn't expected to feel the way she did as she stood outside the house where she had raised Lily. The house was familiar, yet now it felt like a stranger. The lush garden she had tended to for years, the kitchen where countless meals had been cooked, and the living room where the family had once sat together, these places no longer belonged to her. They belonged to Lily and Jake, who had taken everything from her, including the very essence of this home. The same home Sarah had poured her love, sweat, and tears into had become just another asset for them to manipulate, something to be sold or upgraded for the sake of convenience. The familiar white walls and the ivy crawling up the sides of the house reminded her of all the moments she had cherished in that place. It had been a haven, a place where she had believed her family would always be. But now, as she stood on the sidewalk, she could feel the coldness emanating from the house. The warmth she once felt when she crossed that threshold was gone. Sarah stared at the house, her chest tightening as the memories flooded her mind, yet she couldn't shake the anger that rose from within her. What had happened to her family? Where had the love gone? As Sarah walked closer to the house, her eyes fell on a sign she never thought she'd see. For sale. The house, the place she had called home, was now just another transaction, a commodity to be exchanged for something else. The sense of ownership, the years of memories, all seemed to evaporate with the click of a button. She could hear the faint sound of footsteps inside, but it was a hollow noise, as if even the house itself was mourning the loss of what it had once been. Lily, her daughter, had given up everything she had known. The very home where she had been raised was now just another piece of real estate. It was more than just the house that hurt Sarah. It was the idea that everything she had built, everything she had sacrificed, was now being sold off to the highest bidder. She had worked so hard to make that house a home, to give Lily and Jake a life they could be proud of. But in the end, it seemed that pride and greed had taken over. They were no longer the family Sarah had once known. They had become strangers, driven by something far colder than love, selfishness. Sarah's heart clenched as she turned away from the house, the feeling of betrayal seeping deeper into her bones. But it wasn't just the house that needed to be reclaimed. It was everything: her dignity, her strength, and the life she had built for herself and her family. She had been dismissed, erased, and cast aside as if she were nothing more than an inconvenience. Her daughter, the one she had poured her heart into, had turned her back on her in favor of a man who saw her as nothing more than a burden. The pain of that realization was sharper than anything Sarah had ever experienced. That night, Sarah lay in her new apartment, the weight of everything she had lost pressing down on her chest. Her thoughts swirled, but there was one thought that stood out above all the others. Why should they get to profit from what I built? That house was more than just bricks and mortar. It was the symbol of her life, of her love, and her dedication. Sarah had spent countless hours making it a home. It was where she had raised her daughter, where she had poured all her love, and now it had been reduced to a commodity. And then, in the stillness of the night, Sarah made a decision. She was done being passive. She was done letting Lily and Jake think they could control everything. She had the power now, and she wasn't going to let it slip away. With a resolve she hadn't felt in years, Sarah picked up the phone and called her attorney. She would buy the house. She would take it back. It wasn't about the house itself, it was about taking control of her life again. It was about reclaiming what was rightfully hers. The next morning, she made the call. She spoke with a realtor who informed her that the house was still on the market, but there had been several offers. The price was steep, but Sarah didn't hesitate. She made an offer that would make anyone take notice. This wasn't just a transaction. This was a statement. She was no longer the woman who had been cast aside. She was the woman who was taking back everything she had been denied. The offer was accepted within hours, and just like that, Sarah had reclaimed her piece of the past. The news of Sarah buying back the house sent shockwaves through her family. Lily and Jake were stunned. They hadn't expected her to take such a bold step. The realization hit them hard. Sarah was no longer the passive woman they had pushed aside. She had found her strength, her voice, and she was using both to carve out her own future. She wasn't going to let them dictate her worth any longer. When Sarah walked through the door of the house she had once called home, she was no longer the woman who had been rejected and discarded. She was someone different now, stronger, wiser, and determined. The house was hers again, and with it, she felt a sense of pride that she hadn't felt in years. This was no longer about ownership. It was about reclaiming her power. It was about standing up for herself in a way she had never done before. As Sarah walked through the rooms, she felt a deep sense of vindication. She didn't need Lily or Jake to understand her decision. She didn't need their approval. What mattered now was that she had taken control of her life, of her destiny. She had taken back what was hers, and in doing so, she had reminded herself of her worth. The house was no longer a symbol of abandonment and rejection. It had become a symbol of strength and resilience. Sarah had walked away from everything, but now she was walking back in, not as the woman she once was, but as someone who had found her way back to herself. The house was just a part of the journey, but the most important part was the change she had undergone. She was no longer just Sarah, the forgotten mother. She was Sarah, the woman who had reclaimed her life, her dignity, and her future. The decision to buy the house had been about more than just the property. It had been about Sarah taking a stand. It was about showing herself, and the world, that she was not someone to be dismissed. She was not someone to be erased. And as she stood in the house that had once been hers, she knew that her journey had only just begun. She had taken back what was hers, and she was ready to keep fighting for the life she deserved. Sarah had always been a quiet, devoted woman. For most of her life, she had dedicated herself to her family, her husband Mark, and her daughter Lily. She had raised them with love and sacrifice, always putting their needs above her own. She had built a home from the ground up, a place where laughter echoed through the halls and family memories were made at every turn. But now, the house she had worked so hard to create had become a symbol of her betrayal, a painful reminder of how easily everything she had built had been taken away. When Sarah's world came crashing down with the death of her husband, she found herself at a loss. Mark had been her rock, and losing him left a hole in her life so vast it was impossible to ignore. She clung to the one thing she had left her daughter, Lily. She thought that no matter what happened, Lily would be there for her. She was wrong. Lily had become distant, cold, and, to Sarah's heartbreak, complicit in her husband Jake's cruelty. The home Sarah had once nurtured, the life she had worked so hard to create, was now in the hands of those who had cast her aside without a second thought. The final straw came during a family dinner Sarah had prepared with all the love she could muster. Jake's casual cruelty, his callous remarks about Sarah being a burden, shattered the last remnants of her belief in her family. When Lily remained silent, offering no support, Sarah knew that everything she had built, every sacrifice she had made, was nothing more than a faded memory. With no argument, no fight, Sarah packed 2 suitcases, her only possessions, and left, her heart broken and her dignity in tatters. For the first time in her life, Sarah felt truly alone. She checked into a cheap motel, a place so worn down that the fluorescent lights flickered and the air smelled stale. She spent sleepless nights staring at the ceiling, trying to understand how her own daughter could do this to her. It wasn't just the abandonment, it was the complete erasure of who she had been. She was no longer Sarah, the loving mother. She was now a forgotten woman, cast aside as if she never mattered. The pain of that realization was suffocating, but it was also transformative. 3 months passed in that lonely motel room, and Sarah's life seemed to stretch endlessly before her. She had no one to turn to, no support, and no way to make sense of the betrayal. Lily's silence cut deeper than anything Jake had said. Sarah sent messages, emails, texts, nothing. She was invisible, forgotten, and completely alone. The loneliness was unbearable, and the shame of her situation was like a constant weight pressing down on her chest. But amidst the despair, Sarah found something unexpected that would change everything. While sifting through a box of old keepsakes, she discovered her mother's journal. It had been years since she had even thought about it, but as she opened the pages, something stirred within her. Her mother's handwriting, so familiar and yet so distant, filled her with a sense of connection to a past she had long buried. As she flipped through the diary's pages, Sarah uncovered a shocking secret: her mother's affair with a powerful businessman named Robert Sterling. It turned out that Sarah's mother had kept this affair hidden for years, and what Sarah discovered next was even more unexpected. Robert Sterling wasn't just a passing figure in her mother's life. He had promised her mother something that would change everything for Sarah: a trust, an inheritance. For the first time in months, Sarah felt a flicker of something other than despair. She wasn't just a grieving widow. She wasn't just the forgotten mother. She was someone with a secret past, and that past held the key to her future. Determined to uncover the truth, Sarah reached out to Robert Sterling's lawyer, Leonard Goldstein. The response she received was beyond anything she could have imagined. Robert had left Sarah something, a part of his wealth, carefully hidden from his family. Sarah was Robert's daughter, a fact she had never known. The documents, the bank accounts, the property deeds, all of it amounted to over $1 million. For the first time in years, Sarah felt seen. She wasn't invisible anymore. She had power. She had control over her life. With this newfound wealth, Sarah made a decision that would change her life. She wasn't after revenge. She wasn't interested in punishing Lily or Jake. What Sarah wanted was to reclaim her dignity, her life, and her future. She took the inheritance and made a bold move. She used the money to purchase the property where Lily and Jake lived. She wasn't just buying a house, she was reclaiming her place in the world. This wasn't about power for power's sake, it was about standing up for herself, about taking control of her own destiny for the first time. The decision was strategic. Sarah wasn't going to make the same mistake twice. She wasn't going to be passive. She wasn't going to let Lily or Jake dictate her life anymore. By purchasing the property, Sarah turned the tables on them. They thought they had cast her aside, but now they were the ones who would have to live under her rules. It wasn't about punishing them, it was about showing them, and more importantly, showing herself, that she had the strength to take back what was hers. With the house secured, Sarah felt a sense of empowerment she hadn't felt in years. She moved into a modest apartment in the city, far away from the memories of her old life. The apartment was hers. The freedom it offered was intoxicating. Sarah began to change. She started wearing clothes that made her feel confident. She took walks in the morning, savoring the sense of independence that had eluded her for so long. For the first time in years, Sarah felt like she was living for herself. She started attending business seminars, learning about investing, and developing a plan to secure her future. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was planning, growing, and expanding. The woman who had once been so easily overlooked, so quietly dismissed, was now reclaiming her power. She was not just surviving, she was building a future. And every step she took felt like a victory. But despite all the changes, a part of Sarah still felt the emptiness left by Lily's absence. She had always believed that family was the most important thing in life. She had given everything to Lily, and now that same daughter had turned her back on her. Sarah's heart still ached for the daughter she had raised, but the difference was that now, Sarah was no longer willing to sacrifice her own life for someone who had abandoned her. This was a new chapter for Sarah. She was no longer the woman who had been pushed aside. She was someone who had fought for herself and won. She wasn't just a mother. She was a woman in control of her own destiny. And as she moved forward, she knew that nothing, not even the weight of the past, could hold her back anymore. Sarah wasn't interested in revenge. What she wanted was something far more important: her freedom. The freedom to live her life on her own terms, without apologies, without shame. And now, with her future firmly in her grasp, Sarah was ready to face whatever came next. This was just the beginning, and she was no longer afraid of what the future held. After everything that had happened, Sarah never thought she'd hear from her daughter again. The last time she'd seen Lily, she had left with nothing but broken promises and shattered trust. For months, Sarah lived in her new apartment, tucked away in a corner of the city, surrounded by the quiet hum of independence she had fought so hard to reclaim. With her newfound wealth, her sense of self-worth was no longer tied to the approval or rejection of others. But despite all the newness in her life, one thing remained: the space between her and Lily. In the months that followed Sarah's move, she focused on herself for the first time in years. She attended seminars, learned the language of business, and even considered investing in real estate. She wore clothes that made her feel confident, and she took walks in the morning, savoring the peace that came with each step. She wasn't just existing, she was living. Still, no matter how much she embraced her newfound power, there was a quiet ache in her chest that wouldn't go away. She had raised Lily, nurtured her, and loved her unconditionally. But now, her daughter was gone from her life, and that hurt was something Sarah couldn't shake. The silence from Lily had been deafening, but it was a silence Sarah had learned to accept. It wasn't the silence of peace, it was the kind of silence that burns with unspoken words, the kind of silence that screams in its own way. Sarah had tried to fill that silence with everything else: business meetings, personal growth, and new routines. But deep down, she knew the truth. She had given everything to Lily, and in return, she had been discarded. Then one evening, months after the transfer of the property, Sarah's phone rang. It was a call she never thought would come. "Mom?" Sarah's heart skipped a beat. The voice on the other end was shaky, fragile, like it had been holding back for far too long. "Amanda?" Sarah's voice trembled, a mix of hope and fear seeping into her words. She had no idea what to expect. After everything that had happened, she wasn't sure if there was anything left to say. "Mom, I don't know where to start," Amanda said, her voice breaking. "I'm so sorry. I'm sorry for everything, for turning my back on you, for being silent, for letting him push you out of our lives." There was a long pause, and Sarah could hear Amanda's sobs through the phone. "I've been so lost, and I know it's my fault." Sarah sat in her chair, stunned. She hadn't expected this. A part of her had long given up hope that Amanda would ever come back to her, that she would ever recognize the pain she had caused. The rawness of Amanda's voice made Sarah's chest tighten with a mixture of anger and longing. She had spent months trying to heal, trying to put herself back together, and now here was her daughter broken, apologetic, but with no easy way forward. "I didn't know where to turn," Amanda continued, her voice softening. "I let everything fall apart, and I don't know how to fix it. I've been trying to make sense of what happened between us, and I realize how much I hurt you." Sarah stayed quiet, letting the silence stretch between them. She wasn't sure how to respond. The years of pain, the abandonment, the silence, it all felt too heavy to lift in a single conversation. For the first time, Sarah felt the weight of everything they had lost. She had given Amanda everything, only to be cast aside when she was no longer needed. She had always put her daughter first, but now she had to decide if she could do the same with herself. Amanda's apology hung in the air, its sincerity undeniable. But Sarah couldn't help but wonder if it was too late. Could she trust Amanda again? Could they rebuild their relationship after everything that had happened? Was this the beginning of a new chapter? Or was it simply too much for Sarah to handle? "I don't know what to say," Sarah finally responded, her voice steady but quiet. "I don't know if I can forgive you right now, Amanda. It's not just about forgiveness. It's about trust. How can I trust you again after everything?" Amanda's voice cracked. "I understand. I know I don't deserve it. I don't know what else to do. I've been so lost without you. I've been walking around like a ghost, pretending everything's okay, but it's not. I can't pretend anymore." Sarah felt a pang in her heart. She remembered when Amanda was young, when she would run to her for comfort after a bad day, when everything was simple and pure. Those memories felt so far away now. But hearing Amanda speak like this, truly speak from the heart, gave Sarah a glimpse of the daughter she had once known. "I don't know if I can ever trust you the way I used to," Sarah said softly, "but I need you to know that I love you. I always have. I always will. But it's going to take time for me to trust you again, to rebuild what we lost." There was a long pause, and when Amanda spoke again, her voice was filled with quiet resolve. "I'll wait. I'll do whatever it takes, Mom. I just want to fix things. I want to make things right between us." The sincerity in her words was enough to make Sarah's heart ache. It wasn't about forgiveness. It was about seeing the truth. Amanda had been lost, and maybe, just maybe, she was finally starting to find her way back. But Sarah knew that trust wasn't something that could be given away freely. It had to be earned, over time, through actions and commitment. And while Sarah wasn't ready to fully embrace her daughter just yet, she knew that this was a start. "Let's take it one step at a time," Sarah said, her voice calm but firm. "But know this, I'm not the same woman I was before. I won't just be your mother. I'm someone who has learned to stand up for herself, and that's something I'm not going to lose, no matter what happens." Amanda's voice softened, a faint hint of hope in it. "I understand, and I'll do whatever it takes, Mom. I promise." As Sarah hung up the phone, she sat back in her chair, staring at the quiet room around her. For the first time in a long time, she felt something stir inside her. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet. But it was the beginning of something new. The truth had been spoken, and now, Sarah had to decide if she was ready to rebuild. The emotional weight of their history would always loom large between them. But sometimes, healing starts with silence, with standing firm and letting the truth speak for itself. And for Sarah, that was a step forward. One that would take time, but one that, she hoped, would lead to something real. As Sarah walked to the window and looked out at the city below, she allowed herself to feel a flicker of hope. Maybe, just maybe, this was the beginning of a new chapter for both of them, a chapter that would be written slowly, one word at a time. Life, especially in the later years, teaches us that healing often begins with silence, and true strength emerges not from fighting others, but from reclaiming our own dignity. The story of Sarah reminds us that no matter how deeply we may be hurt, the power to redefine ourselves and regain our self-worth lies within. Sometimes we must let go of the past, accept the pain of betrayal, and move forward with quiet confidence. It's not about seeking revenge or punishing those who have wronged us, but about standing firm and taking control of our own narrative. Trust may take time to rebuild, but by honoring our values and learning to live for ourselves, we can find peace. For those who feel overlooked or dismissed, remember that your value is not dependent on the approval of others. You are enough, just as you are. Embrace the lessons life has taught you, and know that it's never too late to start over, to heal, and to choose the path that leads to your own peace and fulfillment. Through every trial, you have the opportunity to rise, to reclaim your voice, and to write your own story, one filled with strength, wisdom, and love. Thank you for watching. We hope this story helped you understand how to approach family conflict and solutions in a healthier way. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and don't forget to subscribe to Silent Wars for more great content. Your support means a lot to us.